profoundly as well. But before I go into that, I will be again saying a few words about the formalities, especially for those people who might be joining us on YouTube. So as most of you know by now, this year's Ouroboros Seminar is organized jointly by the Mind and Life Europe and the Institute in the Making, Metanoia, and is part of a beautiful, broader initiative of Mind and Life, which is centered around two anniversaries, namely the 20th anniversary of Francisco passing in 2001 and the 30th anniversary of the publication of the Embodied Mind. Another thing that I would like to mention is the overall structure of the seminars. Again, for those of you who might be joining us for the first time. So after a 20 to 40 minute presentation of the selected paper, we'll have an approximately 60 to 90 minute discussion. I will be moderating the discussion, so I would kindly ask you to the potential questions via personal messages here. So you just find my name among the participants, scroll down and send the message, the question that you would like to ask. And if for some reason you would like me to read the question, you can say so. You can put that in parentheses, and questions can also be asked on the YouTube channel. So on the YouTube stream, there will be one person, Victoria, who will be passing on the questions to me. And if there's time, I'll try to ask them for you. Now, most importantly, please try to make questions short, clear, and sweet. That is to say, to the point. And one final thing. So due to the time difference between Europe and Japan, our next meeting will be held exceptionally at 10 a.m. CET, Central European Time. So Tom Fruse, the next presenter, is currently residing in Japan, and this was basically the only possibility that we could find. Very inconvenient for all of those who are joining us from the States. And I apologize for this. And again, this is the only exception of this sort. And now I was thinking that for the presentation of the presenter, instead of myself doing this, I might ask a person who knows the presenter way better and might do the job way better than I would do it. Namely, I'm talking about Amy Varela. Amy is a chairperson at the Mind and Life Europe board. And she has played a essential role in the organization of this seminar series. And I would just like to, before I pass the word to her, I would just like to do what I should have done in the first session already, and thank Amy. So thank you, Amy, sincerely for all the work, all the help you've done with regards to this. And yeah. So thanks for that. And now I will just pass on the word to you so that you can present Evan in your own way.
Well, someday, thank you, Sebastjan. Someday we'll have to write a little paper on how we hatched this together.
Maybe so, maybe.
This little egg. But thank you very much. And welcome to everyone who's here today watching. I'm truly a long-term good friend of Evan, and it's an immense honor and a pleasure to welcome him to this series of the Ouroboros discussion series. So thank you for being here, and thank you, Evan, for being with us. So this is Evan's bio. He's a writer and professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia, where he's also an associate member of the Department of Asian Studies in the Department of Psychology and Cognitive Science. He works on the nature of the mind, the self, and human experience. His work combines cognitive science, philosophy of mind, phenomenology, and cross-cultural philosophy, especially Asian philosophical traditions. He is the author of Why I Am Not a Buddhist, Waking, Dreaming, Being, Self and Consciousness in Neuroscience, Meditation, and Philosophy, Mind in Life, Biology, Phenomenology, and the Sciences of Mind, and Color Vision, a study in cognitive science and the philosophy of perception. He is the author with Francisco Varela and Eleanor Roche of the Embodied Mind, Cognitive Science and Human Experience. And he's currently working on 2 books, Dying, Our Ultimate Transformation, and with Adam Frank and Marcelo Glazer, The Blind Spot, Experience, Science, and the Search for Truth. Evan is also an elected fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. So now on a more personal note, Francisco Varela met Evan Thompson in 1977 by way of his friendship with Evan's father, William Irwin Thompson, who founded and ran the Lindisfarne Association. Lindisfarne was a confluence for interdisciplinary exchanges between scientists, scholars, contemplatives, and artists. Its mission was, in Bill's words, the study and realization of a new planetary culture. When they met, Evan was 14, Francisco 31. Their friendship took root during the year Francisco spent as Lindisfarne scholar in residence, following Gregory Bateson's tenure as scholar in residence there. At first, this friendship grew something like a mentorship. Evan says he saw Francisco as a big brother or a young uncle, and as Evan progressed in his studies of Eastern philosophy and philosophy of science, the friendship blossomed into a close working partnership that lasted until Francisco's death in 2001. Evan was at his side just days before he died. So I feel very fortunate to have been close to this friendship, this alliance that engendered profound work and really, truly effervescent conversation. And I'm grateful to Evan for the work and friendship that endure, and for accepting our invitation to be here today and to tell us about this essential, enigmatic text, not one, not two. So thank you very, very much, Evan, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I think I need to share, excuse me, I think I need to share my screen so that you can see my slides. So just give me a second to try to do that. Make sure this works. Okay, is that visible to everybody?
It is.
Yes.
Marvelous.
Okay, good. Okay, well, it's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to presenting this paper and to having the discussion. This is a very rich paper. If you have had a chance to read it in advance, or you know the paper, you'll know exactly how rich it is. It's long, it's complex, and it has many dense and interconnected thoughts. So I'm going to actually need to take a fair bit of time to unpack it. And I'm going to do that by way of saying some things about the background and context for the paper. It really helps to understand what's going on in the paper if you know some of the background and context. And that will lead into just a little bit about my personal story and my connection to Francisco from the period roughly, beginning from the period roughly when this paper was written. And then I'm going to flow into the content of what I want to present. And that is the content that really leads into the heart of the paper, Not One, Not Two. And I'll highlight these things in the outline as we come to them. Okay, so the background and context. This paper, Not One, Not Two, was prepared as a position paper in advance for a conference on mind-body dualism that was held at the Wheelwright Center at the Green Gulch Zen Center in Marin, California. And the conference took place in 1976, July 27th to July 30th. And it was organized by Stuart Brand and Gregory Bateson. These were the participants at the conference. I won't read through all these names here, but some of them will jump out at you. Gregory Bateson, If you know about second generation cybernetics, Gordon Pask, Heinz von Forster, Terry Winograd, very important figure in the work on artificial intelligence in the 70s and 80s. And so this was a gathering of these people, and the paper that Francisco prepared in advance was eventually published in the Coevolution Quarterly in the fall issue of 1976. The invitational paper that Gregory Bateson wrote to the participants for this conference, you can read it online here. And I'm going to quote some things from this paper because it really gives a sense of the larger context within which Francisco was thinking about, the ideas that he presented in Not One, Not Two were in a sense addressed to this context of the conference as set out by Gregory Bateson in this paper. So Bateson wrote, "I have given the name mind-body to the aggregate of matters which I hope we shall discuss. But I hope that our deliberations will be shaped by an agreement at the start that at least the following list of topics is only a listing of synonyms, names, or other ways of approaching the same central concern. Evolutionary theory and epistemology, mind-body, cybernetics, ecology, and indeed theology and ethics are labels for different paths which all lead to the same problematic mountain. I hope also that we may agree at the start that the problematic nature of what we are to discuss has been grossly increased by those philosophies and religions which divide the mind from the body." He then went on to list 5 points that were to serve as the basis for the discussion. And it's important to mention these points because they very much connect to the substance of Not One, Not Two. So first is that phenomena, percepts, events, data, injunctions, descriptions, etc., are commonly linked together in recursive systems and or subsystems. Secondly, that energy is commonly available in such systems to be triggered by events whose energetic content may be large or small, zero or negative. Third, that it is characteristic of the biosphere that the triggering events or variables are commonly differences. 4, that differences of whatever sort are always at one remove from the paired or multiple events in which they are immanent but not localized. Differences thus precipitate news of difference, and this news or information may be of various levels or logical types. The map is not the territory, and the rules of coding by which the map is made and by which it is read are not the map, etc. So this is often summarized by Gregory Bateson in this idea that information is a difference that makes a difference. And then finally, the above 4 characteristics of our subject and subsubjects of discourse apply both to that which we would investigate and to ourselves as investigators. So these ideas of recursive systems, the biosphere, information as difference that makes a difference, the application of these ideas not just to observed systems, but to ourselves as investigators, these are all, of course, taken up in Not One, Not Two in Francisco's own way. Okay, so these ideas, I'm having trouble advancing, give me 1 second. There we go. These ideas figured in Gregory Bateson's book, Mind and Nature, which was published a few years later in 1980. And this brings me to a little bit about my personal story in connection to these ideas and this time. Sorry. Really having trouble advancing properly. Here we go. Okay, so I first met Francisco at a conference called Mind in Nature. This is a report of the conference that is from the Lindisfarne Association newsletter. This conference, Mind in Nature, was organized by Gregory Bateson and my father, William Irwin Thompson. And it was when Gregory Bateson was living with us as scholar in residence at the Lindisfarne Association in Southampton, Long Island, and was working on the text of Mind in Nature. The picture there at the bottom here, you can see Francisco more or less in the center of the picture with his legs crossed. And then the large person with his back to the camera is Gregory Bateson. And my father is sitting immediately next to Francisco on his right. A few other pictures from that conference. This is Francisco talking with, or laughing with, Mary Catherine Bateson, the daughter of Gregory Bateson. And then the other photo is my father in his presentation, and then Francisco and the physicist, David Finkelstein. And this is me from the same period, the same conference, the same event. So that's just a little bit about my connection to when I first met Francisco. So this was 1 year after the paper, Not One, Not Two. Okay, so next, the logic of paradise. Now, here the connection is a talk that Francisco gave the following year at Lindisfarne in 1978, Reflections on the Chilean Civil War. This was also published in the Lindisfarne newsletter. And if you want to listen to a recording of Francisco giving this talk, you can find that here at this site. So this is a marvelous archival material from the Lindisfarne conferences where you can actually hear Francisco give this talk. It's extremely moving. And in these reflections, he talked about how he felt that that things had been pulled out from under him during the coup by Pinochet and the overthrow of Allende's government, and how there was a kind of collective craziness that took over in the whole society. And he said, you see the craziness, the way in which there was a collective pattern in which I was responsible, everybody was, and in which my views couldn't anymore signify anything except that piece of a larger puzzle for which I didn't really have any answer. And then he says, I sat down and wrote some 20 or so pages that I entitled The Logic of Paradise, because it seemed to me for the first time that this had a logic to it. The whole thing had an intrinsic logic that was essentially good, in that it gave me a handle on what paradise is for the first time. I know that might sound strange, but that is what it felt like. That being rooted in the complete chaos and mass killing, out of that was emerging a completely inverse understanding. And I was too scared or something to resist it. So somehow it just got transformed into those pages. He goes on and he says, we must incorporate in the enactment, in the projecting out of our worldviews, at the same time the sense in which that projection is only one perspective, that it is a relative frame, that it must contain a way to undo itself. And that is how he ends the talk. He says, if I'm interested in doing anything at this point, it is in creating a form of culture, knowledge, religion, or politics that does not view itself as replacing another in any sense, but one that can contain in itself a way of undoing itself. Now, you might think that this doesn't have anything to do with Not One, Not Two. What's the connection here? But there is a connection, and the clue to the connection is in an interview that Francisco gave around the same time that he wrote Not One, Not Two, that was actually published also in Coevolution Quarterly before Not One, Not Two. And in this interview with Donna Johnson, he says, if everybody would agree that their current reality is a reality, and that what we essentially share is our capacity for constructing a reality, then perhaps we could agree on a meta-agreement for computing a reality that would mean survival and dignity for everybody on the planet, rather than each group being sold on a particular way of doing things. Thus, self-reference is for me the nerve of this logic of paradise. That is, the possibility of a common survival with dignity of humankind. That paradise is something very concrete, founded on the logic of self-reference, on seeing that what we do is a reflection of what we are. This is the other aspect of my interest in having a full grasp of what self-referential descriptions are, how we can make them approachable, handleable, meaningful. Now, I've never seen the pages that Francisco wrote that he called The Logic of Paradise, But Amy tells me that she has them in Francisco's archive and that they're in Spanish and that they appear to be an early version of Not One, Not Two. So there are two key ideas I want to take, and this is why I've gone into this background in the way that I have. The first is that being able to see things that are normally taken to be separate and in opposition as rather being inextricably involved with each other. So that's the general notion of dialectics that's at work in Not One, Not Two. And shifting to this kind of perception requires moving to a meta level. So that's first idea. Second, we need to do these things if we're to understand how we construct, or as we would later say, enact our world. And this understanding must include understanding how we can undo that way of constructing or enacting things. I think this idea is especially pressing now, today, in that we obviously face, for example, a planetary climate crisis, and we're struggling with trying to figure out how to undo this situation that we've created. And it's an open question whether actually we will be able to do that, I think. All right. This brings me now to the title of the paper, Not One, Not Two. So I'm moving into the paper now itself. Not One, Not Two, or Bui Buar in Chinese, is a stock phrase of East Asian Mahayana Buddhism. My suspicion, I don't know this to be true, but my suspicion is that Francisco took the title or took the phrase from this book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. This book, written by Shunryu Suzuki, the abbot Suzuki Roshi of the San Francisco Zen Center, was based on talks he gave in the San Francisco Zen Center in the 1960s. And Francisco knew this book. Francisco's Buddhist teacher at the time, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, was very close with Suzuki Roshi, and they exchanged students. And Francisco told me that there was a picture of Suzuki Roshi in the meditation hall at Naropa. So I suspect that this may be where Francisco may have first encountered Not One, Not Two, because this is what Suzuki Roshi writes at the very beginning of the book in the first talk. He says, "Now I would like to talk about our Zazen posture. When you sit in the full lotus position, your left foot is on your right thigh and your right foot is on your left thigh. When we cross our legs like this, even though we have a right leg and a left leg, they have become one. The position expresses the oneness of duality, not two and not one. This is the most important teaching, not two and not one. Our body and mind are not two and not one. If you think your body and mind are two, that is wrong. If you think that they are one, that is also wrong. Our body and mind are both two and one. We usually think that if something is not one, it is more than one. If it is not singular, it is plural. But in actual experience, our life is not only plural, but also singular. Each one of us is both dependent and independent." So notice the themes of mind and body, singular and plural, and dependence and independence, as well as the invocation of actual experience and bodily posture as expressing non-duality. So these are all themes running through the paper, Not One, Not Two. One other thing to mention here is that in Not One, Not Two at 2.3.1, Francisco mentions parenthetically that the Buddhist idea of the middle way comes close to what he calls the philosophical superation, the overcoming of dualities that he's presenting. He also mentions Sufism as well. And Francisco had recently been studying Nagarjuna and Madhyamaka, or middle way Buddhist philosophy. And I know this because Francisco and I talked about this book, Emptiness, a Study in Religious Meaning, which is about Nagarjuna and Madhyamaka, one of the first books in English, dating from, I think, 1967, on the philosopher Nagarjuna. And Francisco and I talked about this book a lot at the time that I knew him then in the 1970s. So it's quite possible that this was also influencing his thinking in Not One, Not Two. All right, so now to the paper. First of all, just the structure of the paper. It consists of a short introduction that isn't titled as such, and then it has two principal sections, notes on dialectics and an epilogue on the mind-body problem. And the motivation is stated in the introduction. Francisco says, if there is going to be a change in our perception of the mind-body relation, there has to be a change in the context in which the problem is seen to arise. So what exactly does that mean? It means we have to change the logic we use to understand dialectics and wholes. And so this is the focus, of course, of the biological theory of autopoiesis and the calculus of self-reference and the arithmetic of closure that was talked about in Lewis Kaufman's presentation last time. We have to change our scientific ideas about mind. So mind not as in the head, but instead as what Francisco here, using Gordon Pask's term, calls a conversational domain, and also as distributed to the stable interactions occurring in the biosphere. So later, this becomes the ideas of enaction and sense-making. And then we have to change our cultural conceptions of mind. You could also say our cultural practices. Specifically, we have to include the kinds of experience and training that are central to meditative traditions, which for Francisco particularly meant Buddhism. And of course, this becomes a major theme of the embodied mind, and then also of Francisco's later work on neurophenomenology. All right, so first section then on dialectics. So I'm going to go through the principal sections of this portion of the paper, beginning with what Francisco calls the star. So the starting point of the paper is a conceptual movement from dualities to trinities, which means contemplating how apparently opposed pairs, like mind and body, are related while remaining distinct. So the trinity then is the implicit third perspective from which we look at pairs as not one, that is, they are distinct, and not two, that is, they're mutually implicating and hence inseparable. In other words, they're not disjoint. Francisco says, well, yes, but we need a procedure to find this trinity stance, or to implement this trinity stance, and the slash stands for this. Francisco introduced it as a bit of notation, and he says what it means is consider both sides of the slash. So notice the self-reference. The slash refers to itself in referring to what lies on both sides of it. And he says that we're going to call this whole expression the star statement. So the trinity then is the star statement, which is the it and the processing or the processes leading to it. So the slash is to be read as consider both the it and the process leading to it. Consider both the left-hand side and the right-hand side leading to it. The next step is to show that there is actually something that this, let's say, procedure, this notation, and the concepts behind it can actually do. That is, that it's effective. And here that means that it does give us a way to go from apparently disjoint pairs to their unity in a meta level. And so then we can use it to reformulate dualities like mind and body. And this brings us to the section called Star Cybernetics. And what he does here is he uses a direct, or what we would now call a directed network graph, as an illustration of how the star is effective. So we have the star as a formal structure, I suppose you could say. And now what we're going to be concerned with is considering both the network and the trees leading to it, that is, the trees constituting the network. And this is Francisco's diagram of a network and the trees. And notice that this particular network that he's drawn is an example of a network having organizational and operational closure. These are terms that come first in the work on autopoiesis with Umberto Maturana. And the idea of a network having organizational operational closure is that it consists of mutually connecting and influencing elements that close back upon themselves. And this is the defining feature for Francisco of an autonomous system. And I imagine that many of you have seen this lovely diagram that Ezequiel Di Paolo created to illustrate operational closure, where the black circles are processes that we observe, and the black arrows, all the arrows indicate enabling conditions between processes. And the black circles form part of an operationally closed network of enabling relations. Each black circle has at least one arrow arriving at it and at least one arrow coming from it to another black circle, and it's embedded in a larger web of processes. This is actually a very important aspect for our thinking, because Francisco says whenever we distinguish something like this, that's an act of indication, in the sense that we were talking about last time with Spencer Brown's work. So the observer sees in a complex, tangled web of processes something that stands out for it as having closure. But of course, the beauty of this also is that a system with this kind of closure, as it were, asserts itself in relation to the observer because of the entangled and self-reinforcing, you might say, processes at work in relation to each other. In the interview with Donna Johnson that I mentioned earlier, Francisco puts this by saying, the whole is more than the sum of its parts, it is the organizational closure of its parts. Okay, so now the question then is, we have a network and we have a tree, and how do we go from one to the other? So Francisco starts off by talking about how we go from the left-hand side of the slash to the right. And we do this basically by, as he says, chopping the network. We take one of its nodes as the initial element. So in the tree structure, A is our initial node. And it's important to note here that in an operationally closed network, a network having organizational operational closure, any element can be taken as the initial one. We chop it and make A the start, which is to say that chopping presupposes a chopper with interests in chopping in a particular way, and a time, we might even say a context or situation, at which the chopping is done. Now, it's trickier to go from the right-hand side of the slash, from the tree to the network, because we can't just write out the tree, because that will never take us back to the network as a whole. We just stay with a branching structure. Even if we return to node A at some further point down in the story of the writing, we don't recover the network as such as a whole. So what Francisco says is, well, to do that, we have to eliminate time, and we have to take the recursion to the limit at infinity. And then he says we get the network back as a fixed point of the recursion, as a fixed point of the recursive function. So this is an interesting difference in passage between left and right that involves time and the elimination of time, or taking something to a limit at infinity. All right, so to summarize, we have the network as a timeless whole, that is all nodes and arrows given simultaneously. We have the tree growing in time when we cut the network at a particular node. And 3, we need each side to make sense of the other. And then 4, the star is what gives us this perspective. Now notice that when we look at things this way, we have shifted to a meta level, in the sense that we're able to transit back and forth across the two members of the pair, the network and the trees constituting the network. And we're able to see them as not one. They are indeed distinct, but also as not two. They require each other, so they aren't disjoint. In the next subsection of the Notes on Dialectics, Francisco uses the star framework that we've just gone through to reframe dualities. And the idea here is that we place the whole, or what is holistic, on the left-hand side of the slash, and on the right-hand side, we put the corresponding processes or constituents. And he lists a number of dualities for which we could do this, some of which are, at least to my eyes, amusingly dated. So right intuitive, left logical. very much, you know, the sort of popular discourse of right brain, left brain that even then Francisco was extremely critical of. Female, male. Some of these I think we might not look at in quite this way today. But in any case, it's meant to give an indication of how certain apparent dualities can now be recontextualized or retreated in this star framework. So in each case, the idea is that they mutually specify each other and become a unity as a second order whole when seen from a meta level. And we have a procedure now by which we can shift, namely the star framework, by which we can shift our perception into this mode. Okay, so then in the next subsection, we shift to thinking about evolution in terms of this framework. And evolution here means how dualities evolve both logically, but also temporally. And Francisco's way of talking about this is to introduce a contrast between what he calls Hegelian dualities and star dualities. Now, I'll just say by parenthesis, we could have an interesting discussion of whether Hegelian is really actually accurate to Hegel's own thinking here. That's actually an interesting question, but I'm not going to go into that now. I'm just going to note that we could have that discussion, but Francisco contrasts what he calls Hegelian dualities and star dualities, and this is how he represents this. So the idea is that Hegelian dualities are oppositional or antagonistic, and the logical operation is negation, whereas the star dualities are overlapping and asymmetrical, and the logic is self-reference. So that just summarizes actually what I just said. The idea in the star case is that the levels are imbricated, as Francisco says, that is, they're overlapping, and one term of the pair emerges from the other. The model he gives is predator-prey, where we might think of predator-prey as oppositional, but then predator-prey can become basically the right-hand side of the star ecosystem and species interaction leading to the ecosystem. And so this is meant to illustrate how apparent opposites become the right-hand side of a larger mutually implicating structure when we see the star proceeding dialectically. And Francisco generalizes this in terms of what he calls the interpretive theorem. He says, for every Hegelian pair of the form A not A, there exists a more inclusive star where the apparent opposites are components of the right-hand side. And the highest iteration or version of this, he says, is the universal star, reality levels of reality. So this is, as it were, kind of moving an attempted movement to a kind of maximum generality of apparently opposing structures that get subsumed into a larger star framework and viewed not as opposing, but as mutually implicating from a meta level. And then this would be the sort of maximal case of that. All right, section 4 then, subsection 4 of Notes on Dialectics is called Epistemology. And here what we do is we turn back to reflect on ourselves as observers. An observer, Francisco says, is characterized as having a capacity for indication. So for example, drawing boundaries or deciding on boundaries. A capacity for time, that is a moment when you can intervene and cut a network, or you can start a sequence or start a computation. And a capacity for agreement. In other words, we can reproduce each other's indications, we can follow each other's timed actions, and so on. So an observer is some person or some system that has all of these capacities. So of course, then we're dealing with the dualities observer observed, described, but that should be describer described, not described described, describer described, and subject object. We now apply the interpretive theorem to these dualities, and that gives us, Francisco says, a conversational pattern. He's using Gordon Pask's term here, and the star, conversational pattern, participants of the conversation. So remember, with the slash, it's consider both the conversational pattern and the participants of the conversation leading to the conversational pattern. That's how we have to read this whole thing. And this is, you could say that gives us the mind-body pair as one form of this conversational pattern star, where mind is conversational pattern, body's participants. So we have to see this as consider the participants in the conversation, the embodied participants, as it were, as generative of the pattern, namely mind, in this self-referential, imbricating, and asymmetrical way. The tendency, however, Francisco notes, is that we as conversation participants tend to cut ourselves out and detach ourselves. That is to say, bodies with certain kinds of brains give rise to conversational patterns, but lose sight of their doing this, and then fall back on themselves as isolated and rigid participants. And this can happen in all sorts of ways, through fixated belief systems, through ideologies, through neuroses, etc. And just as a parenthesis here, for a vision of language in this, as we now call it, enactive tradition, that I think really works with these ideas and elaborates them in an extremely rich way, I refer you to this book, Linguistic Bodies, by Ezequiel Di Paolo and Elena Cuffari and Hanne de Jaegher. And this is something, if in the discussion, if Ezequiel is here or Hanne is here, that they want to comment on, I'd be very eager to hear that. Okay, so an aside I also want to make, Francisco doesn't really do it this way, but we could apply the star to the mind-body pair this way. So we have the mind/body. We read that as consider both the mind and the body leading to it, which we have to understand in the sense of the already minded body gives rise to the mind, which then transforms the body. Here, imbrication and self-reference mean that we can take the whole mutually specifying pair mind/body, mind/body, as a level in a ladder of increasing degrees of complexity. And then we do this by putting it on the right-hand side of a new pair, a new slash, environment/mind-body system. So from a dialectical perspective, then we get that transformation. We get a transformation from the star mind/body to the star environment/cognitive system. And that is, in essence, the logic that I follow in my own work in Mind and Life. I don't state it in Mind and Life in terms of the Not One, Not Two paper, but that's basically the logic that I'm exploring, especially when I talk about in the book what I call the body-body problem. Okay, so last section of Notes on Dialectics, Francisco calls paradigm, and he highlights the paradigm shift that happens when we put side by side our understanding of nature and an understanding of the process through which we arrive at this understanding. In other words, when we refuse to bracket out the observer and the actions of the observer. And so this is a key principle, of course, of second-generation cybernetics, generally speaking, in the work of Gregory Bateson and Heinz von Forster. And remember the context of the meeting where this paper is being presented. Francisco puts this by saying there's a strong sense of the observer coming to the foreground, right? The observer is usually bracketed out. The observer is usually hidden in the background or actively occluded. This is actually part of the theme of the book that I'm working on that Amy mentioned in the introduction with Adam Frank and Marcelo Gleiser, the blind spot. Michel Bitbol has also written a lot about this. So in contrast here, there's a strong sense of the observer coming to the foreground. And of course, for Francisco especially, we connect back to action and politics. Remember the logic of paradise. We have to now explicitly recognize that we must take responsibility for ourselves as observers. That is, how we decide what boundaries are, how we chop networks, how we implement this in social practices, in technologies. And unless we do this, we can't undo it. That is, we can't, unless we see how we construct things, we can't undo how we construct them. Okay, so last section then of the paper is the epilogue on the mind-body problem. We have from the foregoing two ideas that we can apply to the mind-body problem. We have, first of all, the star logic, which we could say is, in the case of mind and body, an already minded body giving rise to mind, which transforms body, which transforms mind. This is always looping through the always already organism structured environment, which transforms the organism, which transforms the environment, etc. And secondly, we have the idea of mind as conversational domain. And that basically means mind as not in the head, but as distributed in the biosphere, that is, as ecologically embedded, or as we later say, by histories of organism-environment coupling, or the idea of cognition as sense-making. These are the other terms that Francisco uses in his later work when he's basically talking about the same thing. But Francisco notes this doesn't solve the problem, the mind-body problem, because there remains an unaccounted for residue, and this is experience, the experience of mind. Francisco says we haven't touched at all on that really in the foregoing, and we have to bring that to the fore and deal with it directly. This is a crucial this crucial point is a precursor, of course, to something Francisco writes about much later. Here's an expression of it in the paper Neurophenomenology, a methodological remedy for the hard problem, which I believe Antoine Lutz is going to present for us. So Francisco there puts this point by saying, in all functionalistic accounts, what is missing is not the coherent nature of the explanation, but its alienation from human life. Only putting human life back in will erase that absence, not some extra ingredient or profound theoretical fix. So an extra ingredient here would be, for example, some kind of irreducible phenomenal mentality that we consider to be an extra property over and above the physical properties. That kind of philosophical solution is not really going to deal with the problem that we're facing there. Whatever other merits or non-merits it might have, it doesn't touch this problem. Francisco introduces a new star here. He says, consider the following star being/knowledge, where being means experience. Being goes on the left because it's out of being that thought and knowledge occur. Again, both sides mutually specify each other, and that recognition raises us to a meta level. These statements, nevertheless, still belong to the domain of knowledge. That is, in a way, they're still on the right-hand side of knowledge rather than being. What's required, Francisco says, is a corresponding being. In other words, a corresponding experience, a direct experience, that is, of the interrelation of being and knowledge. And the crucial point is that we can't get this just by thought. That is, the crucial point that we need a shift in experience isn't something that we can achieve just by thinking about it. It takes, for Francisco, some kind of pragmatics, that is, some kind of practice. And he sees this kind of being or experience as embodied in meditation, and later more generally in phenomenology grounded in meditation. And remember, of course, the passage from Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind at the beginning, it's the being or experience of body-mind posture that expresses not one, not two. And this brings us to another fundamental statement of Francisco's thinking. He says, a change in experience, being, is as necessary as change in understanding if any suturing the mind-body dualisms is to come about. And of course, remember that the mind-body dualism is a certain kind of cut that isn't just an intellectual cut, it's an intellectual cut embodied in certain cultural practices that, as we can see today, of course, especially, though this would have been said as well in the 1970s, that have led us into various kinds of crises. And this, of course, is a central theme of the embodied mind and Francisco's later work on neurophenomenology, that we need this kind of experiential change, experiential shift or shift in being, not simply an intellectual solution, as it were, to the mind-body problem. So to conclude then, Francisco says the mind-body problem turns out to be partly resolvable and partly not. The resolvable part is what eventually becomes the enactive approach, where we see mind and body and organism and environment as mutually enfolded in each other, as not one, not two. The still to be resolved part is the need for a correlative shift in being or shift in experience, in what Francisco calls the irreducible basis or the complementarity, being/knowledge. And of course, his later way of stating this, also in the neurophenomenology paper, is lived experience is where we start from and where we all must link back to, like a guiding thread. So I will end my summary of the paper there. And I'm going to exit from the slides. And I need to stop share. There we go.
Thank you very much, Evan, for this beautiful presentation, extremely rich. I loved how you contextualized the paper. This is precisely what I meant when I said that it's a paper that has inspired me greatly, because whenever I read it, I find these threads that lead to topics that I haven't really fully grasped so far. And now you've presented some of these topics that were unknown to me, or I've understood only very vaguely. So it's a very rich paper indeed. So I'm kind of opening up floor for the questions, but before I go to the very specific questions, I would like to ask you a general question, a question of a more historical type, say. It would seem to me from my readings of Francisco's work so far that this is basically the paper where Francisco lays out the program that he then kind of tries to unfold through his works most systematically. What I was always a bit frustrated with is the fact that he didn't really seem to follow up on this with, say, another paper of a similar sort, where he would reflect on these things from a later perspective. What you get is basically precisely what you've depicted at the very beginning of the paper. So he kind of opens up the issue of the context and which specific segments we need to address if we want to solve the issue of the mind-body problem. And then, as you've so beautifully showed, he kind of tries to develop different segments where he does precisely that. So he tries to develop a different logics, he tries to develop different symbols and models, and eventually even ways of cultivating different modes of experience. So I was just wondering whether you knew of, was he thinking of doing something like that? What, or do you know of any sketches, outlines, any ideas, anything of the sort? Because it would seem that there is something missing in all of this. So he was developing these individual segments, but there was no synthesis in a way. Yeah.
I think that so Francisco had a certain style of working that I think of as very much in a way how the scientist works, which is to, formulate ideas that are generative of, new experimental ideas, of new, theoretical modeling ideas, and to constantly be sort of following the edge of that into, into new work. And whereas as a philosopher, you're a philosopher, I'm a philosopher. As philosophers, we like to think, well, shouldn't you step back and, write out some sort of systematic summary, and that's how most of us as philosophers work. But Francisco didn't really work that way, and he even would say to me in conversation, he would say things like, well, I'm not. That's what philosophers do. I don't really work that way. He's kind of constantly carried on by the ideas and then their sort of further development, very much in collaboration with other people as well. So, he worked with a number of philosophers, of course, and the philosophers that he worked with would do more of that kind of work. So he didn't ever really write a summary. There are papers at various phases of his work that summarize ideas. His Organism, a Meshwork of Selfless Selves is very much a kind of summary paper of a number of different threads of his thinking about the organism and about life. So, he did, of course, write papers that took stock at various stages, but he didn't write, philosophical treatises in that sense. And then, of course, tragically, we lost him young, and he would be in his 70s if he were alive today, and maybe he would be writing those things today. Or maybe not. Maybe he would continue to be doing the same thing. I don't know.
Hey, marvelous. Thank you very much. I've received some really interesting questions, and interestingly enough, Evan, many of these are related to your comment about Hegel. So I think I'll let Andreas Weber ask the question. I'm not sure whether he'll ask the same question as other people have asked, but I'm pretty sure that he will go in a somewhat similar direction.
Yes, I won't even ask a question. I will just comment on this. But first, also, Evan, let me thank you for this beautiful presentation. And
thank you.
I am actually deeply fascinated by having a look at these early works, which I did not know so far, although I worked together with Francisco for a year in Paris, and we published together, and I know his later work quite well, but I didn't know these. And I'm pretty fascinated how of the scope and of the radicality, let's say, but also of the way the later ideas are prefigured. So I really do see a sort of continuity. And what I'm going to say about Hegel is also related to this continuity. So when I read that paper, like Evan, I was thinking, okay, did he really get Hegel right in this? Isn't that a little bit simplistic? Isn't that just like my, let's say, basic understanding before delving a little bit deeper into Hegel? And I think actually it is. And it might, in some respect, it might be somehow right from a very detached viewpoint. But if you look deeper into Hegel, I think you'll find that he was actually obsessed with the same problem that that Francisco was dealing with. And you find very interesting comments on that. And I'll end up reading one to you from a beautiful paper on Hegel and purposiveness by an Italian colleague of mine. And but just let me sketch the way where Hegel and Francisco meet, to my eyes. And this is via the Hans Jonas connection, which where I am also at play when I came to his lab and brought this tradition with me. And Jonas is building on it's not very much visible because he doesn't quote, he hides it somehow, but it's clear that he is building on the German biophenomenological romantic idealist tradition. So there's a line from Hegel to Schelling to Jonas. And this is about the unfolding individuality of the living within the whole of reality. So it has to do with dialectics, inevitably. And just to finish, so that was just a comment, but just let me just read a quotation from I think the what work is it? Probably it's a phenomenology of mind of Hegel, but you can find it in that paper. And Hegel says, the living being is the syllogism whose very moments are inwardly systems and syllogisms, but they are active syllogisms or processes, and within the subjective unity of the living being, they are only one process. And I hope it's clear that Hegel is deeply into these things. And I actually never went deeper into this, but probably it would even be very interesting to go on fishing there and to find inspiring ideas. Okay, so that was it to Hegel and Francisco.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think even Francisco, himself would have said later that the use of the term Hegelian in Not One, Not Two was limited and problematic. And indeed, in the later work that Francisco was doing, for example, with you, his thinking is very much and this marks a break also with the earlier work on autopoiesis, especially with Umberto Maturana. He's thinking about this kind of self-reference as actually constitutive of the living process, not simply as something that you have to look at the organism that way, that sort of regulates your perception of the organism in a Kantian sense, but more in a Hegelian sense. It's actually constitutive of the living process itself. And that way of looking at autopoiesis and self-reference is I think very different from the earlier work on autopoiesis, where teleology, for example, is something that's just a description from the domain of the observer. So it's all to say that I think, of course, Francisco's thinking evolved a lot, and I don't think he himself would see that use of the word Hegelian as, terribly accurate with regard to what Hegel actually said.
Okay, there's a powerful dialectical moment already at the very beginning there was a powerful dialectical moment already at the very beginning of our presentation, where we were talking about the doing and undoing, and Hanne de Jaegher has a question pertaining to that. So Hanne, if you're ready, we would like to hear your question.
Yes. Hi, I hope you can hear me because my connection is quite bad. But yeah, I'll say it and see if you
hear you.
You can hear us? Okay, good.
I hear you fine, yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, so I was wondering, you mentioned in the beginning the two key ideas, and the idea, that Francisco had said we have to be able to undo what we have done. And so we need to do this superating of dualities, and it requires moving to a meta level. And we need to do this if we are to enact and construct our world. And this understanding must include now knowing how to undo that way of constructing and enacting. And I was wondering, it seems so, this idea of undoing seems so antithetical to the whole idea of not one, not two, because it has the idea that we can go back in time and and everything will be the same. And actually, I think what the whole idea of not one, not two is that we move forward after we've done something with what we've done and incorporate that or encompass it, and then enact something on the basis of that, which will be changed by the doing, but cannot be undone.
Yeah. I don't think undo there means, or I wouldn't read it this way anyway, going back in a temporal sense and in a logical sense to a way things were before that you enacted them, because that's extremely problematic and of course can't actually be done. I think it's rather the idea that if you make, for example, a certain kind of cut you say this is the system, and we're going to place value on this system differentiated this way. If you lose sight of your having done that and all the motivations and values that went into doing that, then you in effect reify it, and you don't see that there are alternatives, that you can actually step back and say, no, I'm not going to cut it that way. So that's what I take undo to mean. I'm going to stop cutting it that way, and I'm going to do it a different way. Now, I mean, there's a question in any given situation, concretely, really, what would that mean, and how would one do that? But that's, I think, conceptually what's going on there. You know, if we think of it in terms of his own experience, I think the idea is that, you know, he talks about this in the Reflections on the Chilean Civil War, that everybody somehow had gotten caught up in constituting a reality that was absolutely divided and polarized. So that, you know, one newspaper said X, one newspaper said not X. You know, I mean, this is almost, you know, the case in, you know, our world now writ large, right? So this fixation onto certain kinds of ways that things are, that we don't realize we've made them to be that way. And unless we see that, then there's no hope in having it be any other way. That's how I understand what he's saying there.
I find strong resonances what's being said here with some of the ideas that Merleau-Ponty is developing, wherein he is trying to contextualize the difference between actuality and virtuality. So in the human perception and correlatively human action and behavior, every action that is actual is surrounded by the milieu of virtuality. So this is precisely the possibility of undoing what you're doing, because there's always an implicit possibility of engaging with other possibilities. Right. So it's not, like you said, necessarily negating in the sense of taking it back and going back in time and everything will stay the same, but your action is always already also a potential on action, so to speak, because there are other possibilities and virtualities that surround it. Anyway, a question that is that has again come in different forms, but was already formulated last time by Mareike Smolka, and it pertains, I'm going to paraphrase it somewhat and combine different questions together. It pertains to the question of the relation between observer and indication. So in this story, we've seen that the observer is slowly coming to the foreground, and that the observer plays a crucial role in basically constituting differences that make a difference. So by making an indication, as we've said previously, you basically create the universe in which you somehow operate and you are, and then you also co-create yourself by doing so. Now, the interesting question here is, and the one that you and Francisco, if I'm not mistaken, have discussed quite a lot. I think I've read this in either your book or in some other book in one of the footnotes. So the concept of construction versus enaction. So the question is, you know, how contingent, how autonomous, how spontaneous, so how free is the observer of making these distinctions? What does it mean that observer is the one that indicates? Is this something that is completely contingent, as say radical constructivists would have it? And I know that you wouldn't have it, and I'm in agreement with this about this with you. But this question becomes important. So the observer enters the picture. Observer is the one making distinctions, so differences that make a difference. But to what degree is this, say, a free act, and how should one conceptualize these freedoms? So how contingent are these things?
Yeah, well, that's a huge question. I mean, my own inclination with regard to a question like that is not to try to make a universal generalizing statement about what is the case, but always to refer it to concrete cases, you know, be they scientific or philosophical or artistic or political or what have you. So, I mean, there is a sense in which it's always contingent, in that it's always in a context dependent on communities of practitioners, circumstances, procedures and methods available, that have a history. I mean, that's a pile of contingencies, but the contingencies go very deep. So, just because something is contingent doesn't mean that it might not be in some other sense mandatory, or called for. So I think, yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a, I mean, the word construction suggests that you're making something out of materials that are available to you antecedently, and you're doing it for, maybe according to an explicit design, or maybe not. Maybe it's something that's self-constructing and evolving. Maybe it's more deliberate. I mean, these are the kinds of things that are always dependent on the context. But I suppose at the heart of, to bring it back to not one, not two, and the network and the cut, at the heart of this situation is, and of course, our tendency is going to try to think of this in a disjoint way. And so what we have to do is hold these two things together as mutually specifying. The tendency is, on the one hand, to think the observer decides what the network is by drawing boundaries. The other is to think, well, no, there is a difference where we have a network in which all the arrows are, interlocking in this recursive way. That kind of network brings itself forth from out of a background in the ways that that Francisco tried to formalize in the materials that we talked about last time. And so it's not just up to the observer. The observer is there faced with something that is self-individuating itself. Now, the observer can always choose to ignore that or choose to emphasize something else. So it's a conversational domain in the sense of not one, not two. And it's very difficult to think those two things together. And that is, I think that's the task, actually, is to think those two things together. Because, Spencer Brown at the beginning of Laws of Form, just to, connect this back to last week again, I think the first sentence of Spencer Brown's Laws of Form is something like, a universe comes into being when a space is severed or taken apart. It's in the passive voice. A space is severed or taken apart. He doesn't say when an observer makes, a cut. So the system can, individuate and sever a space and enact in that sense. And then, of course, there can be an observer involved in that as well. So that's the really difficult thing to think, is to think both of those things together and not to fall back onto emphasizing one or the other.
I think that processual thinking here is very useful, because the passive voice that you mentioned in Spencer Brown is particularly helpful and useful, because you don't say that the observer makes the cut, because the observer becomes what he is when he makes the cut. So the process of cutting constitutes not only the reality, but the observer himself.
That's right.
And when the reality is constituted, there are new possibilities open. And whenever something is done, observer is born as well. So there's this ongoing dynamics. Anyway, question from YouTube that is related to what, partly somewhat related to what we were talking just now, what we've been talking about just now. It's by Randolph Dible, I don't know, I'm mispronouncing this. I apologize for distorting the name. Is the shift of making explicit of the observer, that is to say, of starring the mind-body dualism and so on, expressed by the calculus of self-reference? How is the later phenomenology related to the calculus? So if I understand this correctly, last time last time and also now, we talked about the act of indication being at the very foundation of the calculus of self-reference that was drawing on the ideas put forward in by Spencer Brown. So how does this then relate to later work on phenomenology and enaction, where you also have this perception and movement being mutually correlated, codetermined, and so on and so forth. So if you could maybe comment on this. So the early work on calculus of self-reference, very formal, and then later phenomenology, but it seems to have a common thread, this notion of action, of movement, of doing, of indicating, of enacting somehow.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think so. Lewis, who I think is here, is much better able to comment on the the early mathematical and logical work. I see Francisco as at that point working with those kinds of logical and mathematical tools to try to articulate and understand self-reference and the broader context philosophically is what he sets forth in Not One, Not Two. Then his thinking, moves on in the way that we were talking about last time, and he doesn't really work with that work as much anymore. He develops trying to look at particular kinds of biological networks like the immune network, or the visual system, or then later neural networks associated with consciousness and perceptual recognition. And the mathematical tools shift there. I mean, he starts working, a lot. Well, I suppose he always did, but I mean, he's really working with the tools of nonlinear dynamical systems theory in that work. So I don't see a direct kind of path that goes from the work on self-reference into those other works. I see it more as kind of ramifying of ideas in different directions, in different contexts with different methods. So if I understand the sense of the question, that's the general kind of response I would give.
I'd like to make a comment, if I could.
Of course.
If you go back to the source of the calculus of self-reference, it's Spencer Brown, of course. And if you think about the beginning in Spencer Brown, then the mark is exactly like Francisco's slash. It participates in the two sides, and it makes the two sides by its presence. And it is an embodied self-reference. Just as the slash is a self-reference, so is the mark in Spencer Brown, referential to the distinction that it makes between the two sides or to the joining of the two sides. So this is a more embodied position about self-reference than the re-entering mark may appear to be formally. And so I think that that if you think about that, then you can indeed see something of the relationship between those beginnings and the rest, embodied mind, neurophysiology, neurophenomenology, and so on.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you.
If I just can follow up with another comment, and thanks for this. To me, Francisco has just followed his own suggestion that we need to become more and more experiential, and what he is doing then more and more becomes an embodiment or an action of the first more formal formulations, I'd say, and in this he becomes more and more radical and less bound to the, let's say, the mere formal logic, and then he also somehow walks out of the relatively formal way of thinking he has developed together with Maturana, I'd say. But I think, and for me this is so fascinating, that he's very true to what he started with. That was so fascinating that I've seen this very abstract and very neat formulation in these first papers, and I also see a clear connection, like Lou said, between the paper we're discussing today and the calculus for self-reference. It's very obvious to my eyes. So it's somehow he does what he's suggesting, I'd say, and so he leaves behind this other stuff because he's becoming more and more embodied in a way.
Okay, on the note of still self-referentiality and the early work, Giovanna has a question about the relation between the star and self-referentiality, and I was thinking whether Giovanna could perhaps expound on this a little bit so that we know what exactly this is referring to, or what precisely you're interested in.
Thank you, Evan, so much for the presentation, and nice to see you. And
thank
you for going so much detail into those really tricky points. I'm still getting my mind around, and I'm still swimming in high waters here. But I think this topic was already touched in actually what Sebastjan you said and what Louis Kaufmann was saying. So I just I'm still struggling to understand the link between this the star and self-referentiality. I missed it completely the first time I read the paper, and then you said it in your presentation but didn't elaborate it. And I mean, I have some hypotheses about what the link is, but I'm really not confident about it. So I wonder whether you could just say something more about it. Can you articulate the way, the sense in which the star I don't know, is self-referential, implies self-referentiality? Because in the back of my mind, I suspect this has to do with then the question of, what Sebastjan was saying before, the observer. Is the observer that is perhaps needed there to make the link between the two parts of the star, and that's where there is a reference to the self. But maybe this is totally in the wrong direction.
I think Louis just put it really quite beautifully. So when you have the star or the slash, the slash creates a left side and a right side, and we're supposed to read the slash as consider both what's on the left and what's on the right. So that's already self-referential, because the slash is an injunction to consider itself as a slash that separates, or not maybe separates, but distinguishes or differentiates a left from a right, where the left is what leads to the right. And then in terms of the dialectical evolution, of course, so like left is body, right is mind. Or left is, predator-prey interactions, and right is ecosystem. Or left is, a network. Sorry, right is left is network. Right is, the trees that constitute the network. So you have a distinction made, but the distinction calls attention to itself as a distinction, in which you're supposed to consider the things being distinguished as generative of themselves. So that's I think the kind of heart of the self-referentiality in the case of the star. So we can look at it, we can look at it in an abstract formal way, and then we can look at it concretely in terms of the actual processes that we're considering from these perspectives, and how they are looping and generative of themselves, and refer back or recursively constitute themselves in the case of, say, mind and body, or conversation and participants, or whole and parts, or whatever it might be. So that's in general terms how I would see the self-reference at work there. But I'm sure Louis could actually say much more about this from a mathematical point of view than certainly than I could.
Louis, would you like
but
to
feels
add?
that he must be quiet now about that.
Okay, then I think Giuseppe has a question, or maybe a comment, not sure.
Yes. Thank you, Ivan. Nice to see you, and thanks for the great talk, and also about these historical and personal recollections that make the matter come alive. My question was about the passage that you cited, where Francisco said, alluded to going beyond the usual logical dialectic of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis by introducing some sort of a different level that you said it was something related to meditation or to the posture. And to me, that really struck me, because I don't know if you are familiar with that famous koan about thinking, about non-thinking, that Dogen recalls in his Zazen Shin. And it's really very, very similar in, I'm gonna read it from the Hee-Jin Kim on his book, Dogen on Meditation and Thinking, where it says, talking about this different level, which goes above thesis, antithesis, and synthesis even. And it says, non-thinking, Hishiryo, is the mind-body-based practice of seated meditation that revitalizes both thinking and not thinking, and therefore promotes the creative interplay between the rational and the non-rational. Non-thinking is praxis, not theoria, gnosis, or logos. I found it very, very in line with what with the passage that you cited. So I wonder if you can comment on that.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to think of exactly the right way to go to the heart of this, but there is well, there's the whole question of paradox that's lurking throughout all of this, I suppose would be what I am inclined to see. It's so not one, not two is paradox. You know, in Dogen, you know, practice is enlightenment. That's paradoxical, because on the one hand, no, practice isn't enlightenment because we think of practice as what we need to do to attain enlightenment. But if we think of it that way, then we will forever thwart the realization of awakening. But if we think that we're already awakened, that's no good either, because then, you know, we don't need to do anything. So, I mean, there's a paradox that's lurking there. It's the same as the paradox of, you know, mountains and rivers are mountains and rivers, mountain and rivers aren't mountains and rivers, mountains and rivers are mountains and rivers. Well, the third one, is it the same as the first one? Well, yes, it has to be, but no, it can't be. So the relation of all this to the not one, not two paper, and here I would actually maybe, I didn't raise any critical, you know, questions in my presentation other than maybe just the aside about, well, is this really what's going on in Hegel? But if I were to raise a critical question, it would be something along the lines of the idea that you can just transition to a meta level that somehow resolves the situation. It seems to me that I mean, there's a sense in which, yes, if you see in the star the self-reference and the mutual, you know, the imbrication and the asymmetry, of course, that's a different perception, which requires taking up a different stance. So in a sense, that's a meta level.
But it's still in the logos. It's still in the
but
theory.
So that's
the interesting thing is that this moves beyond the paradox, and you cannot, in a sense, you cannot solve the paradox with the mind alone. You need something else, and that is provided by the acting body, in a sense.
Right. I mean, that's very much how Francisco, I think, thought about it. He thought that there needed to be a kind of radical shift in experience, and this was what attracted him to, at that time, to Trungpa, who is, of course, an extremely problematic figure, and also to the articulation of those ideas in Zen and Madhyamika, is that you needed to have a kind of radical experiential existential transformation, and that wasn't going to come about just by thinking. On the other hand, that is itself an example of, if you say it that way, a disjoint pair. That is, that there's thinking, which is logos, and then there's, you know, call it what you will, intuition, insight, jhana, non-conceptual, cognition, whatever you want to call it. If you set it up that way, then you're just right back in dealing with the dichotomy.
But that is exactly what Dogen says. There is what he calls shiryo, which is the logical thinking, shiryo, which is the antithesis, the non-rational, the intuitive. But then there is shiryo, which is a kind of meta, but does not pertain to the mental level alone. You need the praxis to go beyond that duality. So that it's very interesting for me that Francisco seemed to have written something very much in line with that.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think that's why it's called Not One, Not Two, and where I think he's taking that from is Suzuki Roshi. So that is the way he's thinking about it. Definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Giuseppe, for the question. And I would like to follow this up with a question from YouTube, which is actually, I would say, related somewhat to what has just been said, and it might even help to shed a clearer light on what has been exchanged right now. There's a comment by MPAGN. I'm not even going to try to pronounce this. The star statement is presented as consider both it and the process leading to it. If I substitute being and knowledge, I consider being and the knowledge leading to it. But this seems very confusing. I also cannot make sense of being knowledge graphically with the diagram showing the imbrication of the term. So the question here is precisely this relation between being, that we can maybe spell out as existence or lived experience, and knowing, probably conceived of as some sort of conceptual / propositional knowledge. So maybe, Evan, if you could say a few words on that.
Yeah. So there's a question about whether you can just use the / kind of. We don't want to use the / indiscriminately. So when he writes being / knowledge, we have to ask, well, what is he trying to express by that? And it looks like what he's trying to express is the idea. I mean, he says earlier that what goes on the left is, holistic, what goes on the right is constitutive. So if we read it that way, then the idea is that there is a non-objectified background of experience of being in which knowledge is situated, but knowledge is also stands in a generative relationship to it. So then we have to ask, well, what kind of knowledge? Well, it's not going to just be propositional knowledge. It's going to also have to include things like, know-how. I mean, there's different kinds of knowledge, right? There's descriptive propositional knowledge. There's skillful practical knowledge. And I don't think we want to limit the meaning of the word knowledge just to the descriptive and propositional there, or there's nothing in the text that indicates we should take it that way. So I think, again, in reading this text, there are places where you can find quite a bit of precision, the kind of precision you would find in a treatise in math or logic, that kind of precision. And then there's other places where he's just clearly working with ideas and he's trying to articulate something. And so I see being / knowledge as a situation where he's basically saying, here we are, we've set out some ideas about the mind-body problem. Nonetheless, there's still a problem. What's the nature of the problem? Well, here's a way of looking at it on the basis of what we've said so far. And now we have to go further even from that.
Okay, marvelous. Now there are several other questions out there. I think
I know, and Lewis keeps putting these incredibly rich comments in chat.
Yeah, precisely. So it's
because they're so rich.
Liam had a question, but I'm not sure whether he's still here. If he is, maybe Liam.
Yeah, well, I was sure. I can just say that I would be interested in because there's a question about remaining in logos, and is the point for Francisco to suggest different ways of looking, because the easiest way to emptiness or to be beyond, to be in that beyond state is to realize that there's different ways of looking. So as long as you suggest anything that's consistent but different way of looking, it frees the mind to enter into that state beyond either, practice or logic. And is that also part of this, would be the question.
I'm not quite sure I got exactly the question. Can you say again?
Okay, if any time one suggests this, or if we say that there's only processes, not objects, you could dispute or undispute, as long as you defend that as a internally consistent way of looking, it undermines the belief in objects, which is the thing that people are highly attached to. So regardless of whether or not we are trying to suggest a completely consistent logical way of looking, nevertheless, the perspective of anybody who considers this, what he's offering, is somehow freed to enter into a state which is not within logic. And is that not part of what he's attempting to do with this paper and for himself? It's just liberatory. Some people use the word liberatory in philosophy for that kind of pursuit.
Yeah, I think I see. There's clearly an aspect of it that involves trying to undo a certain way of looking at things and give us another way of looking at things. So it's not just an undoing. I mean, one kind of project would be just undo things and then there you are, things are undone. But he's doing more than that. He's trying to orient our thinking and perception in a particular direction that includes making space for a kind of experiential self-transformation that he thinks is ultimately necessary in order to deal with the mind-body problem. So I mean, there is a liberatory aspect in the sense in which you're using the word, but I think there's actually more going on there. That's, yeah.
I would expect that. I mean, only to say that one does not have to believe that he is totally enamored with his logic and thinks that it's complete in order to think that it has value, right?
Right. No, that's right. There's no reason to think that. But I mean, for example, by way of contrast, I mentioned that he was very influenced by Nagarjuna and Madhyamaka philosophy, the Buddhist philosophy of the middle way. So Nagarjuna's argumentation in the Madhyamaka Karikas is entirely negative. It proceeds in a destructive way. It basically says, if you assume this, here's the absurd consequence. If you assume that, here's the absurd consequence. And the absurdity is always premised, the absurd consequence is always premised on assuming that there's a certain kind of, non-relational intrinsic being that something has. And so Nagarjuna's arguments are purely kind of reductio destructive arguments. So Francisco's not doing that kind of thing in this paper. He's actually offering an alternative perspective that works constructively with ideas like the star and with imbrication and self-reference and so on.
But Liam probably has a point, and of course, Evan, it would seem that you agree with this, that this is not to say that you can kind of erect an ultimate model or conception of whatever, because that would basically be overstepping the fundamental star knowledge. So by doing this, because so a question from Ezequiel about how to interpret dialectics, but not in a formal way. So this might be interesting.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Evan. I really enjoyed thinking about these things. I mean, I have a comment, but it's a question too, that has to do with, is provoked by the discussion that we are having now. And I, to some extent, believe that perhaps the kind of discussion we're having now is probably deviating a little bit from the spirit of the paper and bringing in dialectics, perhaps in the way he brought in the paper, invites this sort of discussion, obviously. I think dialectics is a much more practical method. And when you raise the questions, I think it was about how do you go to the meta level and so on. I don't think that he could propose a formal way of answering that question. I believe that what happens is that there is indeed an element of practice in dialectics, and that element of practice has to do with what is relevant to us situated observers today, right now, what we're investigating, who we're working with, what are our worries. And that, in a sense, is, in my understanding of dialectics as a method, at the heart of dialectics. In fact, dialectics has also been defined as a method from going from the abstract to the concrete. And I like very much the later work by Francisco Varela on making it concrete. And then this is in fact been happening at the heart of all the enactive approach, the developments in the enactive approach, as you mentioned in your own book. But there are many, many dialectical moves, but they're not formalized. They're just presented as, hey, follow this path and you will see that these two oppositions, in fact, they have an underlying internal relation. Or look at these two concepts that seem to be disconnected, but start looking at their implications, and you start seeing some contradictions or some tensions. What will be the stage at which you need to observe this in order to resolve that tension? So dialectics in that sense serves more as a method that invites your thinking to change adaptively and concretely in the situation in which you are. So I don't think we should, this is my opinion, we should look for very general methodological answers of how we're going to apply this here, how we go to the meta level there. I think we have to use it. It's sort of mental surfing. We need to just learn it and use it. Sorry, that wasn't a question in the end.
No, that's great. That's great. I agree completely with that. I think, I mean, that you said much better what I was trying to say at one point earlier on when I said, I don't think there's a general universal answer. It was the question about contingencies, I guess. I think it always depends on, you know, the context, the situation, our collaborators, our methods, and things like that. No, I think that's quite right. The worry I was raising about going to a meta level wasn't so much a procedural worry about, you know, what's the logic involved. It was actually in a way more a concrete worry, which is, you know, if you try to go to a meta level too quickly, you might actually miss some things that are really important.
Yes.
There may be some tensions there that you don't want to prematurely resolve by just jumping to a meta level. And that was more what was actually in the back of my mind. That was more the worry, which I think resonates with what you just said, is that actually we're dealing with concrete situations. And if we presume that we think we can find a meta level and resolve them, we may actually really miss some very crucial things.
That's right. Yes, it's almost like the method is also transformative of how you are observing and how the possibilities of thinking that you can bring into the situation. And therefore, if you just jump, you just miss a segment of the path that you need to walk in order to get there.
Exactly.
I think
that's right.
As a rule of thumb, I would say, try to see whether you have a spirit of minimalism, to say like, well, what would be the very basic tension here and the simplest way in which it could be resolved that would take us somewhere else. And from there, which is what we try to do in the book and linguistic bodies. I mean, we try to just go to the next thing, because precisely what happens when you jump is that you just missed everything that was in between. And but there is no rule for that.
No, there's no rule. That's right. That's
you
right.
have to know as an observer or your skills or the context of the community in which you're working, they will tell you, this is relevant. Don't jump over this bit because it's important.
Right. That's right. I mean, and that speaks to the importance of having a kind of sensitivity or capacity for, I mean, you could call it different kinds of things, for a kind of empathetic perception or sympathy or sensitivity, or, I mean, and also understanding, where you're actually attuned to the particularities of that situation that are not replaceable by any other one. Exactly. And of course, I mean, this is something Francisco would have certainly did indeed recognize himself.
Ezequiel, if you don't mind, and maybe Evan can also contribute to this, it would be probably interesting to see an example of dialectics at work. So maybe how what we've just said could be applied maybe to the question of language or to living systems or whatnot. It can be a very simple example.
That's why I mentioned the book, Linguistic Bodies. I mean, that whole book, I think, very much exemplifies this.
I could give you one example of how I see dialectics applied to a concrete question that has to do with autopoiesis. And I think it is in the spirit of what we're saying here, although you may still need to translate certain parts. But I don't think we have discussed the definition of autopoiesis in the previous seminars, or maybe we will soon. But what you have, I'm paraphrasing very quickly, you have the definition of autopoiesis as a system composed of a network of processes that, through the operation of processes, realizes itself in the relations between the processes. So it realizes itself, it self-produces, and it also distinguishes itself topologically from the environment. So you have like two conditions there. Let's call it self-production and self-distinction. Now, in the original literature, this is a point of discussion, but these two are just put there. Like, you have to have this and that jointly connected. But you might ask the question, I mean, well, does one imply the other? Could it just be self-production and not self-distinction? And it turns out that you can make a dialectical analysis of these two and find that they're not one, not two, essentially. That if you take self-production, I mean, this is by expanding your perspective and taking a look at the organism in relation to the environment. And if you say, what kind of relation to the environment would benefit self-production? If you try to think isolatedly, self-production on its own, well, it would be a relation to the environment where all the interactions somehow are useful to me. None of the interactions are harmful. Imagine if that's possible, everything would be fine and I could make use of all the possibilities of the environment. But to do that, eventually I'm just dissolving into the environment. I'm not distinct if I'm going to use absolutely every possible interaction with the environment that's beneficial for my life. And then maximizing self-production negates self-distinction. And if you try to maximize self-distinction, what would be the best possible way to make sure that nothing will interfere with your distinction from the environment? Well, you just build a wall around yourself. And that wall will prevent you from any sort of interventions that would just break your distinction from the environment. But that essentially means that you cannot survive because you need to exchange matter and energy with the environment. So self-distinction negates self-production if you maximize it. So what is actually happening here? You have an opposition between these two ideas. And then the way to do that is to apply a dialectical move to say, well, what if you introduce time and you realize that you can adaptively self-produce by taking advantage of some inputs from the environment, but stopping others so that you can self-distinct still. And your self-distinction is also realized through processes of adaptivity that are maintained by self-production. So if you bring them all together, you get a synthesis, if you want to call it like that, which is closer to the concept of agency that has been later developed in an active approach. So that's an example of how you can apply dialectical thinking.
Marvelous. Thank you very much. This was really beautiful. Now the final question. I'll try to again combine several questions into one. And it's basically a question that goes approximately in the following direction. How would you see bringing this critical perspective, so the idea of dialectics that we talked about and cultivating this dialectics, both with regards to the topics and objects of inquiry and also with regards to how one conducts one's inquiry. So how would one bring this critical perspective and this idea of doing with undoing into the practicing communities and, say, policy making? There have been a lot of discussions about finding ways to produce, so to speak, contemplative researchers, scientists, inquirers. So how could one do this, and how did Francisco Varela himself do this in his own practice? So how did he embody he did these elements in his own practice, and how could this then be translated into useful, say, strategies in policy making, in the practicing communities, and so on and so forth? Maybe a few words on that by Evan and anybody else, if anybody else.
Well, again, I mean, I don't think that's a kind of question that admits of a general answer, because there are different communities with different concerns and interests. You know, there are research scientific communities. There are
okay, Evan, maybe if we specify this to make it a bit for you to also answer. Say, how would the two of us as practicing philosophers incorporate this into our everyday activity? For me personally, it would seem that this would mean going in a certain sense back to what was done in the ancient Greece, you know, where philosophy was not merely, say, an intellectual endeavor, but something that was profoundly existential, in the sense of that involved what Pierre Hadot called spiritual practices, for instance. So, you know, philosophers and, say, practicing scientists in a laboratory, how could they somehow use this in their work, in your view?
Again, I mean, I think even there, I would resist a general kind of answer, actually. I think that what's important is the kind of thing we're doing now, where we bring these ideas out for people to encounter. We have a conversation in which many different perspectives interact with each other. And then it's really up to, you know, individual scientists and philosophers, how they're going to move forward, you know, with that. I mean, I have certain things that I try to do in my philosophical teaching that, you know, brings out more of the, you know, that doesn't think of philosophy as just an intellectual exercise of analysis, but, you know, brings out its you know, its existential meaning and significance. Of course, you know, I try to do that in my own work as a writer, in my teaching and the way I teach my students. That's just one particular individual's way of doing it. I don't think I would not, and I don't think, well, I won't say what Francisco would have said or thought, because I don't want to do that. I'll just say that I don't think that one should simply think that, oh, what we need to do is to practice meditation along with reading philosophy. I think that that's very simplistic and naive. I think a practice, you know, so this I mentioned that because in this paper, there's this idea of a kind of different way of knowing that he sees as embodied in meditation. But of course, if we're going to actually talk about that in a richer way, we would have to say, but meditation is itself conceptually framed. It's embodied in traditions that have certain intellectual understandings of what it is and what its purpose is, even if they're so-called anti-intellectual traditions like Zen that try to thwart the intellectual, that nevertheless have this incredibly rich textual tradition and liturgy. So it would be a very, I think, confused idea to simply think that, oh, we should all just start meditating and that's going to somehow, be the recipe. I don't think there is a recipe in that sense. I think, Francisco's journey was an intensely personal one. And that's why I tried to give some of the backstory of his, his personal story. And he was constantly evolving in how he dealt with these kinds of questions. And that's what we all have to do. I mean, we all have to deal with it that way. That said, creating these kinds of communities that we're having right now, I think helps all of us, to find our own way to do that.
Marvelous. That's a very good point as well, with regards to meditation, because meditation in all the traditions is basically embedded into a very variegated context, which includes many other practices and many other ways of approaching the topics that one studies, and some of them are profoundly conceptual, so very rational, say in the Theravada tradition, and even in Zen to a certain degree. So that's a very good point, that just having this idea that you have a scientist who does his own work, but in addition to this, he or she also meditates, and this will somehow miraculously add an embodied element to it, is a bit naive, but it is maybe a step in the right direction, in the sense of thinking about different modes of knowing and how one could cultivate them. So basically opening up the space of legitimate ways and modes of knowing in contemporary academia, which is in itself already a pretty daring thing to do. And I think Annika would like to comment on all of this.
Yes, thank you, Sebastian. I think I wanted to say, and maybe with reference also to Wolfgang Lukas and other people involved in the Mindful Researchers or other initiatives that are close to me, just to say, like, there are more people. I feel like I'm speaking for more people now. But for me, it's not about, maybe, I don't mean to say this could be a general answer, but maybe there can be examples. And for me, examples would be any sort of meeting that, like the form of a listening circle, where everybody shares stories from their background, or there's time to hear everybody's voice, or practice or frames for meeting that somehow bring in embodied awareness and space for maybe movement even as we meet. So I guess those things, they come to mind for me as examples of that also put this into practice. And I just wanted to shortly mention this here. And not only this in a more technical sense, but also the attitude of collaboration, like an attitude where you constantly try to remain open to be surprised by the other's views, or to change your group view, but maybe I'm getting too abstract. Anyway, thank you.
No, I think that was actually very concrete and very clear. So does anybody else have anything to add to this? So the idea of applying these methods, or methods that are similar to the ones that are expounded in the paper, into, say, contemporary academia, contemporary scientific research. Gábor? Or was that just a cough?
Yeah, no, thank you, Sebastian. That's wonderful. Maybe just one comment, that I find it really interesting when someone claims that he is applying or she is applying something. I think it's important that with that statement, you also include the possibility of not really applying it. We tend to fall into the traps of methods and applications very often, and we tend to claim that we do something or we achieve something with that doing. But if we keep the learning of today's discussion, the element of undoing with the doing, the way I would translate it is questioning the doing while doing it. That questioning invites the open space of undoing, not necessarily claiming that you are doing something into the activity that you are doing. And that dichotomy, or that dialectics is, I think, important to keep in mind. Otherwise, we tend to fall into the traps of some fanaticism or some quick solutions. That's just a comment.
Thank you, Gábor. And I think that's a very useful and valid comment, because it would seem that the criterion for what counts as a justified, authentic methodology is founded on the idea of algorithm. And if you have this as the prototype of what constitutes a solid and justified methodology, then basically everything that does not meet this particular criteria is not a proper methodology. So this is also why people always are on a lookout for techniques. Give me a technique, give me a well-defined technique, which is in a certain sense, in its essence, algorithmic. And if I do A and B, it follows CD. So you have something of that kind. So there is a certain ideal that has developed in a specific point in time, early modern philosophy, and it would seem that it has sedimented as one of the ideals that is still permeating the academic realm, and serves as an implicit ideal or a norm in light of which different methodologies are somehow judged. It would seem. It would be an interesting point for further reflection and discussion. Anyway, I think that Evan did a really, really good job here. And I think that we've all become a bit tired. So at this point, I would really, really like to thank you, Evan, again, both for a lovely presentation and for very interesting answers. And I would also like to thank all the participants, both here at the Zoom meeting and those that are watching this on YouTube. Thank you for all the interesting questions. Thank you for all the interesting comments. I apologize for not pass on all the questions and comments, but there were just too many. I tried to synthesize some. Anyway, the next meeting is in 2 weeks. We will have Tom Fruse presenting Francisco's work on autonomy of living beings, so something that is closely related both to today's topic and the previous topic. Thank you again, Evan. Thank you again, everybody else, organizers, Amy, Gábor, and the Metanoia and Mind and Life group. And I'll be seeing you in 14 days. Be well.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.